Recording is on.
Okay, very strange voice. Oops, didn't mean to do that at all. Okay, so I'm going to share the PowerPoint and I think we're ready to go. I'm going to attempt to share the PowerPoint. Let me try again. So could you all mute yourselves, but if you could just unmute one of you to tell me that you can see this in about 2 seconds.
Yeah,
There we go.
Yep.
That's great. Could I just ask everybody else to mute themselves, except, of course, for Eloise? So it's a real pleasure, as I've said, to introduce you, Dr. Eloise Linger from SUNY College at Old Westbury. And your paper today is taking us back to the 1950s, Cuba's Revolutionary Directorate, Vanguard mobilizer against Batista's dictatorship.
Thank you very much.
Could you just remind everybody to mute, please, before Eloise starts, because I really don't want to interrupt her.
Where's the sweetheart?
Izzy, could you mute everybody, or is that something that I can do?
Let me try.
Okay, I don't want to mute Eloise. That's my fear, because that would be disastrous. Okay, if not, I think it's all gone nice and quiet. So over to you, Eloise. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for inviting me, and I really look forward to hearing the comments. I'm also very happy to see so many women here. I think we almost have 50%, if my quick glance is correct. I just wanted to start off by saying that I did do research in Cuba. My first trip was in 1990. I did my doctoral dissertation research there from late 93 until late 94. I lived there throughout that period of time, except for part of summer vacation when I had to come home. And I did a lot of research interviewing, which is what I'm presenting, just a little teeny part of that today. And I also did a study of the revolutionary press from 1959 to 63 through 63. But some of the most interesting information that I got was from people who actually participated in the revolution. And among those was a group that I had hardly heard of before, which was the Revolutionary Directorate. So I'm just going to start out with a more general historical perspective and then get right into the people we're talking about. For several reasons, students have played a significant role in Cuban politics from the early ideas and movements for Cuban nationhood and independence from Spain. They continued through 20th century movements against dictatorships and for constitutional reform and revolution. Next slide. Some of the early student actions in Havana, which were at the early university, which was not yet the University of Havana. In 1781, they protested a policy saying that if they didn't pass their exams the first time, they would have to enroll in the colonial militia. There were many other incidents, but these are the highlights. 1820, they supported the constitutional movement, including Felix Varela, a seminary student who was active that you may know of. 1851, they placed signs "Death to Spain" on the doors of at least one university building. I'm not sure if it's more. 1853, they wrote at the end of an anti-colonial tract, "Viva Cuba y viva libre." 1871, what I call the accidental but very important martyrs of November 27th. 1892, the first student strike because Spain was refusing to grant doctorates from the University of Havana. And that right was reinstated in September of 1892. Okay. While students and youth have been vanguard activists, not all students who inspire revolutionary action were actually conscious leaders or even political activists. In the historical context of the 10 Years' War, 68-78 by Cubans for independence from Spain, a group of 8 Cuban medical students became forever the martyrs and inspiration for Cuban nationalism. Next slide. This is a book about 1871, the front cover. However, by most accounts, including what's in this book, they had done nothing but some minor mischief around a cadaver cart after their professor had not shown up for class. Apparently, the medical school, the cadaver cart, were both near a cemetery. Someone from the armed militia of loyal volunteers, that is the Cuerpo de Voluntarios, reported the students as having desecrated the tomb of a supporter of the Spanish king. Now, 3 years into the shooting war that began in 1868, the Spanish colonial authorities were nervous, and they had to placate a mob of mostly illiterate men who were serving because they had strong feelings of loyalty for the monarchy. They had been organized by the monarchy to terrorize Cuban citizens. And once a volunteer accused the students, the rest of the mob demanded vengeance. The regime held 3 phony trials before reaching a verdict that finally satisfied the bloodthirst of the volunteers. The verdict was prison terms for 45 students from the medical school and the execution of 8 others, including 2 who had not even been in the city at the time. Go on to the next one. The youngest executed was only 16, while the others ranged in age from 16 to 19. On November 20, I had November 21st, it's November 27th, 1871, the 8 medical students were shot by a firing squad in Havana. Next one. The shooting is illustrated in an oil painting here. The utmost oppression became a dramatic part of the rich history of Cuba's anti-colonial war of 1868-78 and beyond. And it's forever, I think, in Cuban history seen as a student sacrifice for the Cuban nation. Thereafter, the execution of the 8 students has served as a symbol of youth sacrificing themselves for the noble cause of independence and Cuban sovereignty. Here, let's go to the next one. Here, the Free Cuban of November 27th of 1897 reminds readers to remember the sad day of November 27th. By 1899, with Spain's soldiers on the run, a student commission held the first formal memorial for the 8 martyrs, sponsored by the University of Havana. All illustrations that you've seen here were taken from the 1871 book. And next, that's just, you saw it earlier, but everything that you've seen so far has come from that book. Okay. The actions of the 1870s plus the 1700s plus Felix Varela and student actions of the 19th century, including the medical students, left the legacies of youth as leaders, a reason for the prestige of Cuba's university students and the university itself. Patriotic commemoration of Martí's birth were, and I imagine after COVID will probably be celebrated again in the famous torchlight marches gathering on the magnificent steps of the University of Havana. And that would be the next one, which I'm sure most people here, or I assume most people here, have seen this view of the university from across the street of the great stairway. Youth movements usually led by students, including protests and revolutionary movements on other continents and in varying political contexts. We're familiar with many of those. In 20th century Cuba, The bare highlights of student movements included those for university reform and militant action against dictatorial governments. The 1920s and 30s include, and that would be the next one, the movement for university reform, establishment of the Federation of University Students, the radicalizing work of Maya in the student movement, and he was also a young communist. 1920s and 30s struggles against the Machado dictatorship, and in 33 and 34 support for the radical Gutierrez and Joven Cuba in the Revolution of 100 Days, and the formation of the Revolutionary Student Directorate, both of those latter two being radical groups. And again in the late 40s, anti-colonial actions against various dictators. And some of the people that I'm quoting from in this paper have were actually active. They're old enough to have been active in the late 1940s. Young revolutionary people in the 1950s were members of the Revolutionary Directorate, the 26th of July movement, and the Popular Socialist Party, the three main organizations struggling to oust the dictator Batista, and once victorious, to push forward the Cuban Revolution of 1959. All three had a base in the student movement. Between 1955 and the victory of January 1959, the 26th of July movement, and then it was called the 26th of July Revolutionary Movement, led the great majority of civic organizations and mobilized vast networks of clandestine activists throughout the island. Although less discussed in standard revolutionary histories, activists who would later form the Revolutionary Directorate had been leading the University of Havana's student movement in a confrontational and revolutionary direction from the moment of the military coup of March 10, 1952. The leadership of the official Federation of University Students was won in 1954 by the dynamic Jose Antonio Echeverria, who gained influence in other universities, colleges, and secondary schools around the country. He also made alliances with striking workers and enhanced the prestige of university student activists across the island, even beyond it to international student associations. Before going more deeply into the special history of the Directorio, it is important to realize that their vision reached far beyond the student movement, and they did recruit farmers and workers who confronted serious economic issues as well. A very big structural, we can go to the next slide. A very big structural problem in the 1950s was that Cuba's economy did not create enough paying jobs for its growing youth population. You can see here that the total males between ages 15 to 25 doubled, or more than doubled. And the numbers in school actually increased tenfold. However, that still left a growing number of unemployed youth, neither in school nor with a paying job. There's a little discrepancy in the last two figures from 1931 and 1953 because the figure of 23.2% unemployed was actually taken during the dead time. So it's very high. That is when there was no sugar harvest. And in 1953, the figure was down to 14%, but that's because it was during the harvest when there's a huge increase in the number of working people to bring in the sugar cane and then process it. While many unemployed youth may have been reached by the political outreach of the various leftist organizations, many migrated abroad to find jobs, a pattern long known to Cubans throughout the neo-colonial decades of the Republic and onwards. U.S. data suggests that over 2,000 Cubans migrated in 1945. And the number was nearly 15,000 in 1956. But thousands more worked as undocumented workers or tourists who stayed beyond their visa in the United States. Cuban scholars estimated that 40 or 50,000 young people over age 18 migrated to the US each year. Now, that doesn't mean they all stayed here. They migrated here, and then many of them went home too. In the 1930s, 10,000 Cubans lived in Tampa and another 10,000 in New York. However, by the 1950s, there were roughly 5 million living on the island, while 150,000 Cubans were estimated to be living in the United States. Those Cubans, especially the more established ones with families, would become a strong source of support for the Revolutionary Directorate and the 26th of July. In most histories of the Revolutionary Directorate may have been mentioned in a sentence or two about their valiant but crushed attempt to storm the presidential palace and Radio Havana on March 13th, 13 de marzo, 1957. Their charismatic and nationally prominent leader, Jose Antonio Echeverria, was mentioned as having been killed by the police on that day. The research here will add information about the historic, although sometimes hidden, roles of the Revolutionary Directorate. And my approach, as I mentioned earlier, was to listen, to study the history of the revolution, was to listen and record members of all three organizations. I tried to get a balanced number from each of the three major groups, as well as those in higher, middle, and lower levels of leadership. I sought 50% female interviewees, and I achieved not 50%, but something approaching that. Questioning more than 40 participants in all three groups, I was fortunate to find leaders from the Revolutionary Directorate who were willing to share their histories and analysis 4 decades after their youthful days of activism and risk-taking. I aim to answer 2 questions: why and how they became active revolutionaries in the years 1952 to 59. The interviews revealed material missing from at least the English language historiography of the revolution. To previously written histories of the revolution, this material adds firsthand observations, memories, and insights by former members of the Revolutionary Directorate. I'm going to skip a little bit and just go right over to another paragraph. At the Student Center of the University of Havana, much of the 1952 leadership of the FEU had thought of themselves as being groomed to become Cuba's new politicians. Many of them were expecting to partake of the self-enrichment game that had become a permanent feature of renewing Cuba's Republican governments. Student government leadership was so prominent in Cuba that student elections and statements were covered by the national press and had influence on the country's politics. But that long-standing careerist approach to university education was being challenged fiercely after 1952. And I'm assuming everybody here knows that Fulgencio Batista came to power in a military coup on March 10th of 1952. And that, to quote Tony's book, within 3 hours of the coup, end of quote, the leadership of the FEU met and asked, they wanted the ousted President Carlos Frios to give them arms to fight against the new dictatorial government. Next one would be Jose Antonio. And this is not immediately on March 10th, but this is a student demonstration of some sort with Jose Antonio in the middle, holding the flag I don't know the exact date, but I recognize this part of the University of Havana in the background as they're moving out into the street. The radicalizing student leaders characterized some of their peers as careerists seeking power or money, as I mentioned, and or as connected to gangsters. They had different views on the morality of leadership, and these radical students wanted to get rid of the selfish, ambitious leaders of their movement. Indignant students criticized both the careerist attitudes and what they called bonchismo, that was described as the influence of cliques of students with close ties to the gamblers and gangsters, heavily involved in gambling, prostitution, and tourism in 1950s Cuba. It was even said that a few student disputes may have been settled by guns, although nobody I interviewed offered such an account. The more revolutionary-minded student leaders wanted a different future for their country. By distinct methods over a few years, these student leaders aligned with gangsters were expelled. And as hatred of the dictatorship grew, greater numbers of students came to see the only way to end the dictatorship was to militarily defeat it. Although the University of Havana was far larger and had a more direct impact on the national news and student views, the smaller and newer University of Oriente, with 3,000 students, and the University of Las Villas and some Catholic universities were also active arenas of struggle against the military seizure of power and in opposing it on many fronts. And next one. Some of the aims of the radicalizing student leaders, as I just mentioned, ending careerist mindset of students, ending bonchismo, cleaning up the republic by cleaning out corrupt practices in the university, using the university to make change and build a better movement, a better country, oppose the dictatorship by an armed movement, and end Cuba's poverty, unemployment, and to provide education, housing, and health care for the population. One of Oriente's, these were shared by students across the island, not just the University of Havana. And I guess we could go to the next one now. One of Oriente's students from the University of Santiago de Cuba became a respected historian, Jorge Ibarra. He recounted, he's also one of my interviewees, they were enrolled in the university a group of new young people. This is at the University of Oriente. Frank Pais, Jose Tellez, Vilma Espin, Nilsa Espin, and other compañeros who initiated, along with me, the opposition to the dictatorship. Maybe the Federation Estudiantil Universitario, the FEU, would have an attitude of repudiating the regime, of protesting, of struggle in the streets against the dictatorship. I was part of that group that would later become the group led by the 26th of July Revolutionary Movement. And that was an end of quote by Ibarra. In terms of geographic spread, students at the University of Pinar del Rio today, in the far western end of the island, recently have discovered and are trying to incorporate the 1950s actions of young oppositionists into local history teaching in their province. Local farmers, workers, and students were active, and many of them were members of the Revolutionary Directorate. The discovery in Pinar del Rio suggests that there are more local records in periodicals, police records, personal recollections, family archives, and perhaps other recorded oral histories. The Directorio's history is starting to emerge from the shadows. While students waged ideological battles inside classrooms and in other areas of the universities, a more revolutionary segment of students began winning over people to an armed struggle approach, especially after the July 26, 1953 armed attack on the Moncada military barracks. The increasingly repressive nature of the military coup also convinced more young people that it had to be opposed and defeated with armed resistance. There was no democratic way to defeat it, since Batista canceled the national elections of 1952 and forbade any public show of opposition. But the opposition was indeed alive and growing, both in numbers and intensity. The background to the interviews ends with my repeating what I heard from both groups about the very close relations between the 26th of July and the Revolutionary Directorate. They may have competed for student members, but they also worked together, shared supplies, including arms that were hard to find, and they even fought together many times. And the first one I'm going to mention is Luis Blanca, and I've quoted much more of him and his interview. It's still only a tiny fraction of the interview, but in this paper, most of what I'm going to be reading in terms of quotation, the bulk of it is from Luis. He entered the University of Havana in September 1951, the academic year of the March 1952 coup. When interviewed in 1994, he mentioned his earlier anti-corruption activities while still in high school before the coup. And I'm quoting, "Look, the first political activities I had were in Camagüey, studying in the secondary school. That is when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. The political activity was because the governments in those years were dedicated to robbery. That is, a politician tried to get in power to enrich himself while in power. And it was like that throughout the Republic. All the governments we had in the country had been corrupt, thieves, bandits. Actually, all the citizens were jaded and disgusted with all that. The disgust was coming down from the parents to the children. Then it was already in us as youth of 15, 16, 17 years. In those days, Chibas was preaching with his famous shame against money, and the youth were very receptive to this preaching of Chibas. So I participated in student struggles in the Institute of Camagüey, the high school, against the politicians of those days. I finished high school in Camagüey and came to study in Havana in September of 1951. Months later, when Batista made his coup d'etat, I was studying engineering. I lived on M at the corner of 23rd because I was at the university. From that first day, I came to the conclusion that Batista had to be forced out by use of arms. And then there began the road of conspiracies and the mass struggle in the streets against the dictatorship from the first moment. When Moncada took place in July of 53, I already had been taken prisoner 2 times from demonstrations in the streets for participating in public acts against the dictatorship. End of quote. He emphasized the political importance of the University of Havana in the fight against the dictatorship. And I quote again, "There's one important thing. That is the merit of the university students of our epoch. The only institution of the country and the only entity that existed and opposed the dictatorship of Batista from the 10th of March, 1952 to the 1st of January, 1959 was the University of Havana. The FEU, the only collective, the vanguard of the students. The university was the only place in Cuba that remained those years with an open opposition, clear, transparent, against the dictatorship. There had been a tradition. It began to create a Julio Antonio Mella in the year 1923. Then that tradition of political struggle against corruption and for national sentiments It began in the university with Maya and later the rise of Jose Antonio when he took the presidency of the FAO. End of quote. When I asked if the struggle for the presidency was easy for Jose Antonio, Luis Blanca answered, and I quote, "No, it was not easy. The president of the FAO was elected, and there was an enormous quantity of tendencies within the university student body in those days. The first time he became president, when he took the presidency of the FAO was by substitution. He had been the Secretary General. There was the president, the vice president, and the third position was Secretary General. The president finished his studies and left. Then the vice president, some months later, also finished and left. So Jose took the presidency, but by way of the third substitution. That was in 1954. In 1955, he was elected president, but listen, the presidents of the faculties were 13. Jose Antonio won the first time with 7 votes, 7 of the 13. Those 7 were Fructuoso, Anilo, Nuri, Luisa Camacho, Nico Guevara, Jose Antonio, and I. 7 of 13 by the minimal difference. The second time, already in the year 1956, he had 9 votes. Look at how far the contradictions reached. Already he was president with 9 votes. When we spoke to those other 4, quote, "We did not have the feeling that you voted against Jose Antonio. Already as a president with 9 votes. We want to give the state the sense of revolutionary unity against the dictatorship." They, the 4, said no, that every one of them was against him. So they left an historically clear record that they were opposed to Jose Antonio, from which I conclude that, like in most political situations, there's not unanimous agreement, especially, well, I won't say especially among the left, because there were all kinds of tendencies at the University of Havana. And you could go to the next one. This, of course, is just a shot of the university. I asked him about the nature of radicalization, and he answered, "The university was a center for training in arms. The university was the only place where Batista's police did not enter. Many of the people of Moncada learned to manage arms at the university. Miret, who was a university student in those days, was one of those who trained the people for the 26th of July movement. Well, it was not yet the 26th of July in those days, right? I know that the group preparing Fidel had many arms training sessions they carried out in the university because it was a very safe place. They taught the use of arms. They guarded them there. They left and returned the following day. It was a very secure place. It was the only place in Cuba where the Batistianos were clandestine. For example, there came a minister of Batista at the university for an activity, and the students kicked him out of the university. That never happened in any other place in Cuba." 16. Next slide, please. Excuse me. This is a founding document of the Revolutionary Directorate, and it's signed by Jose Antonio. There might be some questions about the nature of this at the time, but it was signed in February 24th, 1956. And at that time, he was both president of the FAO and head of signing and founding member and the head of the Revolutionary Directorate at that moment. A member of the FAO could be whoever, whether a member of a clandestine organization or insurrectional or whatever, as he or she chose. This is according to Blanca. But he points out the FAO was not selective. It was massive, and it came to have weight as a public election, open. It was not compatible as an organization with an insurrectional movement or organization. And yet the Revolutionary Directorate was to be the armed part or arm of the FAU. There were students from the 26th of July, but they didn't manifest themselves as a group at the university. When I asked him about socialist youth or other organizations, Blanca said, quote, yes, they had their university organization. The only one that maintained a university section was the socialist youth. And they brought candidates to the school. For example, the socialist youth ran a candidate who won the presidency of the School of Engineering. They maintained their organization as cells. Next one. This is just a representation of, and this is based on research done by Pepe Tabares or Jose Antonio de Real. I don't know if you know of him. He's primarily a historian of the neocolonial period, but these figures were pulled together and when I asked about it, and it basically compares the strength within the student organizations of the 26th of July, which of course has roughly double the number or more, the number of schools in which the Revolutionary Directorate has organizations. And it's a breakdown by public high schools, technical schools, primary teachers college, and so on. Just basically showing the outside of the university system that there were also student organizations and revolutionary organizations were active in them. So both the 26th of July and the Revolutionary Directorate gained the overwhelming support of Cuban youth as reflected here in this table. I look at the time. I'm going to skip a little bit further down here because if I'm not mistaken, I think you can interrupt me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe we're at 40 minutes already, right? Just about?
More or less, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, something like that.
All right. Well, I am just going to skip through down to the next slide, which I believe is the Pact of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
This is basically a pact signed in 1956, September of that year. This is after the 26th of July movement the 26th of July attack was in 53. The leaders of that were arrested. A big amnesty movement occurred. The university students continued to be active. There was a very, very important sugar strike in 1955, which I'm not sure if I'll have time to cover, but the Jose Antonio and the Revolutionary Directorate leadership from Havana to Oriente were active throughout the island in that strike. And it also, again, enhanced the national importance of Jose Antonio. And this pact is between Fidel for the July 26 movement and Jose Antonio for the Directorio, basically saying that they agree on all principles and on the armed struggle to get rid of Batista. And I'm quoting Blanca now. The only person with whom Fidel Castro Ruz had signed a document as equal to equal in all his life was with Jose Antonio Echeverria. Fidel came to the conclusion that he had to sign that historic document with Jose Antonio. It was for the assessment he made at the time of the validity and the transcendence that the figure of Jose Antonio had in Cuban life. If not, he would not have done it. Next. And that's just a photo of Jose Antonio. Okay, the next one. This is also in 1956. I don't know if this was a time of the signing, if these four members of the directorate went there to with Jose Antonio or if this was someplace else or a different time, but it was also in Mexico in the same year. And these are from right to left: Fructuoso, Joe Westbrook, Bowery Shimon, who later became a very prominent member in the revolutionary government, and Juan Nuiri. 3 of those were killed in various incidents. Why did the Revolutionary Directorate decide to make the attack on the presidential palace, in which so many of them got killed? And I will quote again from Blanca. And he says, after Fidel disembarked on after Fidel disembarked on the 2nd of December 1956, the Directorio felt pressured politically, historically. That is, Fidel was already fighting. Then the Directorio's answer to the 2nd of December, that is when the date Fidel landed and with the group from Mexico to go into the Sierra Maestra, the Directorio's answer was the assault on the presidential palace of March 13th, 1957. During that terrible attack, Jose Antonio and many, many others were killed. Actually, he was killed. He had gone to the radio station while others attacked the presidential palace. And as he was leaving and heading back to the university, the police stopped in his car and killed him. And not long after the assault on the presidential palace and the radio station, in which Jose Antonio and the others had been killed, the regime went on an intense campaign against the group. And you can move to the next file. This is the building at 27 Humboldt Street. There was an informer's tip that several remaining leaders of the Directorio were meeting there or living there, whatever. And this is just it's just a little over a month later, on April 20th, 1957, an informer's tip led the police to an apartment on Humboldt Street in the city of Havana, where most of the remaining DR leaders were meeting. All present were massacred. Batista maintained his iron fist, although he may have taken a big political risk, as the population was becoming sick of the murders and brutal atrocities of the police were carrying out against student leaders. Under fear of the student movement, he ordered all secondary schools to close for a week after the March attack on the palace, and again for another week after the April massacre at 7 Humboldt Street. The next one. These are 4 of the guys who were killed there. This one, the first one on the left is Fructuoso, who you saw in the other photo, and the one on the far right is Joe Westbrook. And the second from left is the student who had actually helped assassinate, was probably the main one assassinating the head of Batista's Secret Service, the SIM. And back to Blanca, saying, look, after the 13th of March and the 20th of April, the organization continued, decapitated, and materially liquidated. That is, the organization stayed but lost its main leaders. Jose Antonio, who was the greatest leader, then a substitute who was Fructuoso, and all the weapons had been lost. And later, I will just mention that I'm not going to have time to read more of Luis's remarks, except to say that he was quite active in exile, raising money. He and Bowery Shimon were 2 of the major leaders of the whole group. They were 2 or 3 of the major leaders that survived and continued. They were able in only maybe less than a year, I guess about 10 months. You can go to the next file. They had landed in January with weapons and began work in the Escambray, although there had already been some former members of the Directorate who were there, but there was a huge factional difference, and that other group became known as the Second Front of the Escambray. I'm not going to go into that, but later in 1958, as the 26th of July forces came across the island after basically defeating or in the process of defeating Batista's army, which was quite demoralized at that point. This is a proclamation signed by the commander for the 26th of July, which was forces, which was Che Guevara, and for the Revolutionary Directorate, the next one, the Pact of Padrero I'm sorry, I didn't realize that other one was another directorial statement. When they landed finally and started fighting in February, there was a 5-page document. I'm sure Faure Chamon must have had something to do with that long document. But they basically sort of pulled their organization together again, and they did sign. And the next shot would be of Rolando Cubela. You can see how young he was. And he was the commander of the Revolutionary Directorate forces in the Escambray. Okay. I'm going to just move now to I have summaries of several people's interviews, but I assume that you would probably like to ask some questions. I just wanted to conclude with, if we can go to jump down to slide 20. Yes, well, actually, that's Faure Chamon as a young Chamon. And he later became, well, he was basically, after Echeverria's death, he became pretty much the political leader of the Revolutionary Directorate. And we can go to 30, which are, oh, okay, I'm not quite, yeah, here's Blanca. Just a few highlights I will summarize here about his remarks about the student movements discussed with the corrupt governments, high school youth being involved. The coup was immediately opposed by the FAO. University was the only place to completely oppose the coup. And the difficult election of Jose Antonio, and how they almost ended their group, and how the remainder of this have continued solidly with the revolution. And that would be the next quote, I believe. Whoops. Well, let's just go through these. These are some of the other people that I interviewed. A young woman who was a member of the Directorate and who knew many of the others who died at Humboldt Street. And the next one, I think, is Yolanda, who was a working class student, a founder of Action Bayamese and of the Women's Brigade of Bayamo, and who was with the 26th of July and went to also the United States to do work in exile. And the next, Faure Chamon. Interesting, I thought the family background of leftist thought and action. His father had been an active member of the Communist Party. And I go on to the next one because we're really, oh, I guess we missed Luis Blanca's picture. I don't know if it's okay. You flipped through it. The one color picture that I have was
Let me see if I can find it. Hold on one sec.
There we go. And his remarks was, well, the people of the Revolutionary Directorate, all of the leaders stayed and supported the revolution and we're still here. That was a quote in my interview, but this is a picture that, and there was an article about him in Juventud Rebelde in 2013, as he was at age 80. So he is one surviving member who's still alive, and I hope he's still alive and healthy. And then we can get finally to the last shot, which is the Fae is one of their publications in exile. And this was from 1958, November, almost the end of the struggle of the insurrectionary period, almost a month before the taking of the change of power. And you see, it was the 27th of November, and they're talking again about the student martyrs from 1871 in their publication Alma Mater, which was published in exile. And there's Jose Antonio, and we can conclude that, well, he's in heaven. And I guess we can stop there and move into some discussion.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful way on which to end. Jose Antonio in heaven. Thank you, Eloise. That's the problem with history. There's just so much that happened in such a rich period of history. But thank you very much for doing that wonderful job at trying to give us the trajectory, specifically in the 1950s. So if anybody wants to make themselves visible, that would be great. We can use the chat. If you don't want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand if you prefer to do that. Over to you for questions and comments. Tony, over to you.
Okay, just checking on. Yes, you can hear me.
Yeah.
Many thanks indeed for that, Eloise. That was fascinating stuff. Some of the stuff I hadn't actually heard of before, so really good material there. So a couple of questions arising from that. I'd just like to know a little bit more. You talked about the split, a little bit briefly about the split in the two factions in the Directorio when they were in the Escambray. Now that split led to one group becoming anti-revolutionary. They were led by Gutierrez Menoyo and yes. Morgan. Was there any evidence of that split? Did you come up with any evidence of that split in gestation earlier in that movement?
Yes. Well, first of all, many of the arms from the 1957 attack somehow got into the hands of Gutierrez Menoyo, and they went early to the Escambray in 57. However, by the time Faure and the remnants of the Directorio, including Luis Blanca, got to the Escambray in 58, there were already differences, and almost from the beginning of Faure's landing and bringing many others from the Revolutionary Directorate with them, almost from the beginning there were differences with Menoyo. I read, I think it was your book, but it may have been someplace else, that that Faure Chamon signed they signed the agreement with Che reluctantly. I didn't get that from my interviews. Of course, you know, the course of history, there are many different interpretations as to how they felt about signing it. I understood that they were quite grateful to sign it because, remember, the Directorio by this time is quite small. And even though they have active forces in the Escambray, I mean, the revolutionary ones, not the ones who became, I don't know if they became associated with the CIA, but they certainly were suspected of being with the CIA, Menoyo. So it's not clear to me whether it was reluctant, they were reluctant or not, but they did sign, and the two of them fought together very well in Las Villas from November until the actual victory.
Thank you. Incidentally, I got that from Faure Chamon himself.
Mhm.
So, but he was a bit embarrassed about their reluctance. So
Okay. Did he say that they were reluctant, or he felt that they were? Did you get
he,
that from him?
I inferred it from what he said, so I may have overread it.
Mm.
Anyway,
I had 2
I'll hand over
days
to
of
someone else.
interview.
Okay, so we have a question from Maria. We have a question from Ruby, who's willing to wait to ask her question. Maria, over to you.
Oh, hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I learned so much and that was very, very fascinating. I'm also I'm scared my question is not very relevant to the discussion, but I work on anti-colonialism, and every time I hear the word, I kind of want to ask about it. So you mentioned it in terms of the anti-colonial dimension of student protest before, and also briefly in Directorial. I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on that dimension, and as well whether if there was any international connections that or links that they established with any other groups or any anti-colonial groups. Thank you.
Well, I think the entire history of Cuba almost, and I will include going back 400 years to slave revolts, because that's part of the anti-colonial history too, not just when there are European Cuban students at the University of Havana, but Cuban nationalism runs deep, at least in the writings since the early 18th century, at least since then. And I think that it probably began even earlier. And certainly by the 1950s, remember, Cuba, when it got its independence, first of all, it defeated Spain and had some kind of autonomy in 1897, and then the United States marches in 1898 and claims to have been the victor over Spain, although it really, the Cuban revolutionary forces had pretty much done the job and made a lot of sacrifices already. But the United States, as most of you probably know, imposed the Platt Amendment right on the very first year. To have their independence, they had to agree to accept this amendment from the United States Senate that said that the United States could invade Cuba at any time to maintain order. So many of the people I talk to refer to the entire 20th century until the revolution as the neo-colonial period, because U.S. interests and so on. In terms of the other part of your question about international connections, I did allude to international student organizations. Jose Antonio, for example, went to, he went to more than one that I know of in Latin America. And he went to one, I think, in what is now Sri Lanka. At that time, it was Ceylon. I'm trying to think of other, I'm sure there were links to other anti-colonial organizations in places like New York, Mexico City. I mean, all the places, Caracas. Cubans immigrated, I mentioned to the United States, but actually when I was talking about Cubans going abroad to work and to study, they went to other countries in Latin America as well, not just the United States, of course. That would be a very colonial attitude in and of itself, to say that they came to the United States. But they went to other countries of Latin America. So there were many international connections all along. And of course, they linked up with many other anti-colonial activists throughout Latin America, long before, the current epoch of nationalist Venezuela and all the more modern anti-colonial movements.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we have Ruby. Ruby, you should just seize the day, ask your question, and then we have Jackie after that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was amazing, interesting. I definitely learned a lot of new things, and I found it. I was trying to write a lot of notes, so I might not have got this exactly right, but yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. I wanted to ask about a few things. I wanted to ask about you mentioned, well, you said that the University of Havana was a really important center for resistance against the Batista dictatorship, and that they were openly against the dictatorship from the beginning, and that the police didn't enter the Havana University, and that even Fidel was training people there to use arms. And I just wondered, do you know more about how that was possible? Was it just that it was done? Because if they were openly against the dictatorship, I'm just wondering, like, that sounds like, how did they not just get how did they not just come in and rush them and like try and get rid of it? I just think it's just really interesting, and I'd never heard about that before, and I just found that really interesting. And I kind of thought, I wonder how that managed to continue to be like a beacon for organising if it was openly happening when the dictatorship was so ruthless. And you spoke a bit about how there was a quote about how the different student groups worked together, but they also kind of were trying to win over students. I just wondered, like, was there anything else that was distinct about the different student groups? Like, what I understand that they had similar aims and that they kind of shared those like anti-corruption aims, but was there any other things that were distinct about them? Like, why would you join one and not another? But yeah, thank you. It was really, really interesting.
Okay, I have a few. Any other question that you want to go? Should we take 2 or 3 questions?
Are you happy to do that, Jackie? Do you want to ask your question?
I'm writing them down.
Excellent. Over to you, Jackie.
Yeah, mine isn't a question, but I find it really interesting, the wealth of information that could so easily have got lost because of, from the interviews and obviously the decreasing number. The thing I wanted to highlight, and I said it before, it's like, even if I only take just one thing from today, and I've got some notes and things that I had not noticed or made the association between the 27th of November being the anniversary in 1871 of the student martyrs, if you like, and the significance of that date last year with the 27th of November being linked to the San Isidro and all the claims for the artists wanting, whatever they wanted and protesting in front of the Ministry of Culture. And I just so appreciate what you contributed, Eloise, and whatever we get from these, because I didn't notice. I hadn't previously noticed that the 27th of November was that significant. And although we're not living in 1871, there's memories persist. And I just wanted to make a comment about that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackie. That's a really interesting point that you've made, actually, how history can be co-opted, history can be re-semanticized, it can be given new meanings, or people can make claims to history and historical dates. So that's great. Are you up for one more, Eloise, before you start to answer?
Miriam. I don't know. Miriam have a question?
Great. Over to you, Miriam.
Sorry. Related with the question or what Jackie asked, Cuba always remember the 27th of November, and more of these things are done in date to provoke. It's the provocative element of organizing against the revolution. They know the meaning, but they want to make a connection with that, which in deep is an ignorance of the Cuban history. And it is repeating again now. It's very sad that those that are opposing the Cuban government are using phrases of Fidel Castro, and that confuse the people. It's not that they don't know the history of Cuba. They are playing with that to provoke. Sorry, Eloise, but it's my knowledge of the Cuban situation right now and what it was.
No need to apologize, Miriam, at all.
No, sorry. It was absolutely, I have enjoyed immensely being graduated from University of Havana and having such an active life there. I really enjoyed your presentation enormously. Thank you very much, Eloise.
Thank you. Let me try to cover some of these issues. First, I'm going to start with the police and how on earth did the university have arms training at the university and the police didn't come in and just arrest them all. There's a tradition in many parts of the world, not only in Latin America, it's also true in some African and Asian universities where police and governments were not allowed to enter. Now, I don't know if this is because most of the students were kids from the ruling class, and the governments and the elites insisted that the police stay out of the university for that reason, but somehow there was a tradition, it may have even come from Europe, that tradition that police do not enter the university for any reason, that they can't go in and arrest people. I mean, in the late 20th and 21st century, I think that's pretty much disappeared from the world. But so it's natural that we would be so very surprised that the police didn't just go in and arrest them all. But they did it. And in fact, this relates also to the fact that the prestige of the university that I was trying to get across, where not only did the police not go in, but the national press covered the student government meetings and the student government elections as if it were just like it were a national Congress or Parliament or something. I mean, they had tremendous prestige, and they were proud of the university as well. And now it's not that Fidel was training his soldiers at the university. I just that was one little thing that you might have gotten from that. Other people were doing the arms training, including probably of Fidel himself. But they did it regularly, both the 26th of July and the Revolutionary Directorate. And in fact, there was one case where the police tried to come onto campus. This was a night demonstration that the students were having. And at the building you saw, there are two buildings on the sides of this stairway. And during one of these night demonstrations, students were actually firing down toward the police. So, I mean, it's a very unusual thing and difficult for us to imagine, but that did happen in the 1950s. Next question about the competition among the groups. Why would you join one and not the other? Well, I suspect that one of the reasons is that based on what I know of the student movement and a radical movement that I grew up with in the 1960s, I think it just depended a lot on who you came in contact with in the first place. That's my take on it. There were ideological differences. Certainly the socialist youth of the PSP, that is the Juventud Socialista, were definitely opposed to the armed struggle of Fidel in the 1950s and to the Revolutionary Directorate. partly because they saw them as adventurist or putschist or ultra left. And in the case of the Revolutionary Directorate, many of the Revolutionary Directorate members were also religious Catholics. This kind of conflicted with the ideology of communist parties in the 1950s. So, and there were certain kinds of prejudices going back forth both ways. So, but I think my general take is that it depended on who you met first and who you knew. In the case that, like one of the women I interviewed, she joined the Revolutionary Directorate because that's where her friends were, and people from her hometown were active in that. On Jackie's point about historical memory, Cubans have great historical memory. It says my microphone appears to be noisy. I don't know if it's from papers or if it's just too loud.
No, it's when your papers rustle. It's fine.
I'm sorry.
You're absolutely audible. No, it's perfect.
That's where the mic is probably down there where the papers are.
It's fine.
Okay. I do want to comment about historical memory in Cuba because, yes, these dates are very much kept alive. And like I say, January 28th, there's the memorial, that was the anniversary of Marti's birth. And every January 28th, there's some commemoration. The November 27th date that we discussed here. There are many dates. There's the December 2nd when the grandma landed. I mean, when I was there in the 1990s, I remember there were events around December 2nd. Of course, the 26th of July. Also the 13 de Marzo, the 13th of March, which was the attack on the presidential palace. That's also celebrated and commemorated. I'm sure there are many, many more that I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but there is great historical memory and great nationalist sentiment and anti-colonial and anti-imperialist sentiment. And of course, with the embargo that Cuba has to live under, it's totally understandable that it continues to this day.
Okay, so I think you've probably answered, or we've got a queue forming now. So we have Cliff first, and then we have Al, and then we have Miriam again. So Cliff, over to you. Sorry, you have to unmute yourself, Cliff. Sorry.
I was thinking about unmuting and then I forgot. The Jitsi platform is not familiar to me. Anyway, I wanted to thank Eloise for this presentation. I thought it was wonderful. The question I had actually has already pretty much been answered. Just 2 minutes ago, you were talking about the PSP and the youth. My question basically was what kind of organizational relations or relationship did the PSP have with the Revolutionary Directorate? But as I said, you said a few things about that already, so I won't pursue that. I'll just thank you again.
Thank you.
So Al and then Miriam.
Yeah, well, like everybody else, I'll start off by saying fantastic, Eloise. Very, very rich. Looking forward to reading your article, expanding more of it. The quick question, when you think of Fidel and where he went, the statement that he made, history will absolve me, which we think of it that way, was very important. It marked that from the beginning, he was something more than just anti-dictatorial, more than just pro-bourgeois democracy and stuff like that. Now, lots of other people, lots of other radicals in history have also taken similar positions, and many of them have backed down once they're in power, under pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is there anything from the Revolutionary Directorate? Is there any, you already mentioned the significant role they played in the sugar strike, which is obviously shows something of the same sympathies and interests. But my question is there anything like that where the Revolutionary Directorate developed this other aspect of their resistance to the order beyond the anti-dictatorial, anti-democratic aspect of it.
Do you want me to answer that now?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yes, one of the things that because I had to kind of cut it short, I practiced it, but you know, somehow when you practice it, you do it a lot faster. And so I had to leave out a very important point, which was how interesting it must have been in the University of Havana, in the places where the students hung out, you know, where I'm sure they had debates in the classroom too. They were thinking about what we would call socialist ideas back in the early 50s. And in fact, in the late 40s, in many of these things, one of Humberto Castello, who is, I have a very great interview with him, I think, points out that we were socialists without a party, discussing their ideas and the kind of debates they had among themselves and the discussions in the anti-colonial movements. Like, you know, there was this group that tried to go to, they never made it, but they had this expedition where they were going to go fight against the forces of Trujillo and the dictator in the Dominican Republic. So they had this kind of these feelings of solidarity with other oppressed people in Latin America, but they also wanted to have major social change. And the important thing about History Will Absolve Me is not just that it was a legal defense, but it laid out a program. And I have interviews with Mujeres Martianas, who many of you may know were quite active women in the civic resistance in Cuba. They had really close connections with the leadership of the 26th of July movement and with all of the movements. And in those accounts, I mean, they talked about how the efforts they made to distribute that, because that was the main programmatic document of the 26th of July movement for making a revolution and winning political support. So there was a high level based on many historical factors, not least of which are the waves of immigration from Europe, anarchists, socialists, communists coming from the middle of the 19th century onwards. The whole heritage of revolt against slavery and anti-racist content, although that wasn't explicitly spoken in the History Will Absolve Me, but it was implied. So that I think that there was quite a consciousness in a great deal of among the intelligentsia, but also among the working class. There were a lot of political leaders in the labor movement, not just members of the Communist Party, but it did include members of the Communist Party. There's a new book that is new to me that I've just started to read by Steve Cushion on the influence of the working class in the victory of the revolution. And I think there'll be more of that in that book that I have just started. But anyway, I agree that there was a great deal of political consciousness that was revealed in the History Will Absolve Me. And it was clear that, yeah, it wasn't just anger that there was a brutal dictator in power. It was a desire to thoroughly change society.
Thank you, Eloise. So we have Miriam, Jade, and we may just, no, Miriam's saying no, that's fine. So Jade, and I might just ask a question with my chair's prerogative right at the end. Over to you, Jade.
Right, thank you for that great talk. I found it particularly interesting that the 26th of July movement had signed a kind of an accord with the DRE as early as, was it 56, I think you mentioned, which is not something I was aware of. One thing that I've come across in literature that people use to differentiate the DRE with the 26th of July movement is the DRE's kind of strategy of striking at the top versus the more guerrilla warfare approach of the 26th of July movement. I was wondering if you thought that was kind of an exaggerated difference, considering that they did have an accord as early as 56 with each other?
Well, that's a great question, one that I didn't touch on in here. Yes, when I started doing my research in Cuba, one of the things that struck me was this attitude of hitting at the top, or striking a blow at the top, that came through in all of the members that I talked to from the Revolutionary Directorate. And yes, it was a different approach, but they also had an approach. It wasn't their only approach. They also had an approach that they had to win over the masses of the people, which they did. And they specifically said and make the connections between the students and the workers in Cuba. And so there was that distinction. The reason they signed an accord was in the Pact of or Letter of Mexico was partly because the student movement, while Fidel was in Mexico after after they were released from prison in May of 55, the student movement was still quite active, and of course it was growing like crazy, and it was very important, I think, and again, the prestige of Jose Antonio was really significant. And I believe that was one of the reasons they signed that, and also to show unity. I think it was very important to show the Cuban people that there was unity among the revolutionaries. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Excellent. So if there's no more short questions, I am going to, because I know the minute that I start thanking Eloise, you'll all leave. So before you do that, I'm going to do the advert again. If there's anybody here who's new to the Center for Research on Cuba, the Cuba Research Forum, please look us up. Just look up the webpage, Center for Research on Cuba, University of Nottingham. You'll find my email. If you'd like to be on the mailing list, if you're on Facebook, if you look up Cuba Research Forum, it's really nice to be welcoming new members pretty much every time we have an event. So thank you very much for attending, and please continue to attend. We're delighted to have you. So Eloise, I'm going to finish with a very, very short question, because you dropped it in at the beginning, and you talked a little bit about it. It's more about your fieldwork and your insistence on trying to find 50% of your interviewees as women. How did you get on with that? Were there challenges built into that? Did you have to really search? I imagine you have done. Can you just talk to us just briefly about that whole process?
Well, I had my very first trip to Cuba was in 1990, and it was a post-grad course sponsored by Flaxo, Latin American Faculty of Social Science. And it was at the University of Havana. And I met a number of intellectuals there who were teaching the courses or came in to do a guest lecture or whatever. And at that time, I was just interested in moral and material incentives, and I hadn't really thought about what I was going to do doctoral research on. And I wanted to do something on the Cuban Revolution. I wasn't sure exactly, because my own studies in graduate school were primarily on social movements and revolutions, in a both sociology and history. I have like a double combined. We had a combined PhD at New School. And once I figured it out and asked, I got help from one of the people who had been teaching at the Flaxo. That was Pepe Tabares. And he was very good in looking up the people and trying to get, like top leaders like Valery Shimon, and then, mid-level and low-level. But to get the women was not so easy. And that tended to be, it was somebody from the 26th of July that actually connected me with Mujeres Martianas. And that wasn't done through the official he wasn't an official mentor, I guess, but everybody knew that he was helping me, and he did help me a lot. I would never have been able to get all those people to talk to me as a North American, they would never have given me the kind of interviews they did had it not been for his intervention and his introduction. But for women, I had met some women from what was in 1992. I went to a meeting that was the preliminary meeting to before there was the Women's Studies Institute at the University of Havana. And from that group, I met one or two women who directed me. So among the women, I had more of a snowball approach. But among the men, it was all very formally arranged. Among some women too, and one of the most interesting women outside of the city of Havana was a woman, Latina, and I've published something in the journal, International Journal of Cuban Studies. There was an article about, in which I have her as one of 3 people quoted. She was quite active in the area of Trinidad and was really taking messages all the way up to the high command of the revolution, which of course would have been Fidel, Celia Sanchez, and so on. Mm. But when I interviewed them, they tended to be more in groups, like Ane came with Yolanda. I wanted a woman in Havana from the Revolutionary Directorate, and she and her best friend Yolanda both came, and then turns out Yolanda has this big revolutionary history too. And the Mujeres Martianas, I met with 4 or 5 of them, often 3 or 4 at a time. So it was an interesting way and a different way of doing interviewing. But I don't know if I answered all of the questions.
No, you absolutely did. Thank you. I was curious, and you've answered it beautifully. I think it's 6:31. You probably deserve. I don't know what time it is there, but you probably deserve some sort of beverage, tea, coffee, or something. Definitely in UK time. I think we've reached that point. But it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. We look forward to all of this work being published.
So do I.
You have a crew of admirers already. Oh, Alex just wants to say one thing. Alex, very quickly. While we're clapping. Alex.
Oh.
No, en verdad iba a aplaudir y toqué el lugar equivocado.
Bueno. Aplaude. Perfecto.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Eloise. Really, it's been an honor. So
thank all of you.
Okay, cuídense. We have another one next week. It's more literary, but that doesn't mean you can't come. Literature is vastly important. So this is Emilio Gallardo and Jesús Gómez Tejada de Tejada hacia una poética de la literatura criminal socialista. So if you rush to your computers and join the Cuba Research Forum mailing list, you will be in that next mailing, which tells you where and when. Pero hasta pronto, hasta la próxima. Mucha suerte. Y
adiós.
Cuídense mucho. Adiós.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Luego.
Gracias a todos. Gracias, Eloise. Gracias a todos. Chao.
You say compañero? I mean, what would...
Compañero. Excellent. Thank you, Eloise. That was absolutely great.
I feel really silly. I've been speaking for a great many years, and I actually thought I had a better handle on the time than I did.
It is the nature of doing it online. You just lose track completely. You don't pick up body language. You don't do any of that. So you just end up enjoying yourself, and then suddenly, whoops, everybody's doing it. Don't worry.
It's a different sense of time, so please don't worry about it. Online is completely different. It was really fascinating.
They were wonderful. I enjoyed it so much.
Oh, thanks, Barb. I recognize that voice.
You have a fan club. That's fantastic. Eloise will let you go on and rest, but you did a marvelous job.
Okay, well, thank you all again. I do look forward to more of these seminars.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye, Bob. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Now this one, I'm trying to get, this one's different to get out of here. Okay, bye.